Hello, hello, welcome everybody. Good afternoon to those of you here and those of you who are joining us virtually. I am Laura Tuck, Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank, for those of you who don't know. I think a lot of you know that back in December at the COP24 in Katowice, we launched our World Bank Group Climate Targets. And so when we got there, well, I should back up. Before we got there, the opening of the COP was, as many of you know, a little bit gloomy. We had just gotten the IPCC report and the US climate assessment, and the mood was a little bit down about where we were. And then the first opening day, we had the privilege of having our World Bank Group CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, arrive and present these climate targets, which were extremely well received and really provided a big lift in terms of what was possible and how stakeholders were stepping up to try to solve the problem. I think it really gave a boost to the atmosphere. I had the privilege of following her there, and we got so many compliments for the bank really raising the ambition and encouraging others to do more. So that was great. Now today what we want to do is take those overall targets and really drill down on one of them, which is adaptation. And it's great because Kristalina has been a huge champion and booster of this topic, many of you know. She's been driving us here in the bank to raise our ambition and also really encouraging us to put a much bigger focus onto adaptation. We're also very privileged to have Andrew Steer here with us. Many of you know that he is the president and CEO of the World Resources Institute, and he has also been a fantastic and tireless champion for climate action. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us. They will both help us frame the conversation today and talk a little bit about why adaptation matters and why we really want to step up our attention to this issue. And then we will have the team that worked on the Adaptation and Resilience Action Plan talk to us a little bit about what it is. It's the first of its kind here in the World Bank Group. And so then we will hear from them, and we will then have a conversation with all of you. So let me turn now to Kristalina to share with us her thoughts on adaptation. Thank you, Kristalina.
Thank you very much, Laura, and the team that has worked on the action plan on climate change, adaptation, and resilience. So what I want to say at the start is, if you haven't gotten it, please do. It is not that often at the World Bank when we present a short, concise report to our readers, but we did it this time. I want to start from the days when I was a humanitarian commissioner, 2010, 2015. When I got a front row seat on the tragedies that push people in situations when they depend on generosity of others just simply to survive. And a changing climate very clearly was one of the reasons. In 2011, there was a huge drought in the Horn of Africa. The impact of this drought is to be remembered because it led to famine in Somalia and parts of northern Kenya. Famine in the 21st century. And at that time, I traveled to various places. And I would never, ever forget going to southern Somalia and then to a place in Kenya and seeing what a huge difference focus on resilience brings. In the southern parts of Somalia, we, on top of the drought, they were also struggling with the conflict. We were supporting a center for children that were affected by malnutrition, made much worse by the drought, much worse. So I walked in this clinic for malnourished children. It happened to be when I was coming from my hometown of Sofia, where my, at that time, toddler granddaughter was in my hands. She cried, she laughed, she played. And here I was walking in this room with maybe around 40 children. And the room was dead silent. Children not only could not laugh, they couldn't even cry. And this deafening silence, I would not forget for as long as I live. And then I traveled to Nyale, a province for about 100,000 people in Kenya, northern Kenya, where over the last, the preceding 6-7 years, there was a partnership to build resilience exactly to that, droughts that are hitting more often and are more severe. The impact in Nyale was dramatic and positive. The prevalence of malnutrition among children was 50% lower than in the neighboring province, because of simple things that have been done by partners, including at that time the European Commission I represented, like when you see the sign of drought, you get trucks that travel to bring measurements as early warning for malnutrition and miracle food, so it doesn't happen that children unnecessarily suffer and even worse, die. So I carried this image with me. I carried images from going to places where floods come more often and are more severe. I carry a memory from meeting the president of Chad, President Deby, who sent me to a city in Chad called Mao to see what he told me was unbelievable, cannot be true. And it is floods hitting so drastically that they digged some 20 meters into the ground of Mao, splitting Mao into two. He said, droughts, we know, floods, why? What is going on? Figure it out. So I'm here to tell you that we as an institution committed to development, we have this enormous responsibility to figure it out and help communities and countries act early, build resilience to what we know they're going to be facing, more frequent, more dramatic climate disasters. And the good news we can present today is that over the last years, with the support of our board, we actually have been building more experience in how we can build resilience in small islands, in communities that are at risk of droughts and floods, and how to build this fabulous transmission line of lessons from one place to another. So what is learned in Bangladesh, or what is learned in Kenya, or what is learned in Ethiopia, can be transmitted to other places. And today we are formalizing our commitment to be the institution that brings a very simple statement in practice, and it is good development ought to be adaptable in the face of climate change, and adaptation, resilience are great for development outcomes. Very simple, two sides of the same coin. Let me make 3 points at this opening. The first one is on our institutional commitment to fight climate change. Focus on adaptation does not mean that we are deviating from the duty we have to help countries for their own sake and their competitiveness take on a low-carbon path. It is integrated in the way we work. But focus on adaptation in a development institution with a mandate to eradicate extreme poverty is so very important, and we are catching up on making adaptation in our climate action placed on equal footing with what we do on mitigation. Last year, we brought financing for adaptation for the first time to about the same level as financing for mitigation. 2, in our action plan, we are putting very simple framework, and it is commitment on money, commitment on mainstreaming adaptation in countries' development plans, and commitment to measure adaptation properly. So these are the 3 pillars of the adaptation action plan. On the first pillar on boosting financing for adaptation, we kind of stuck our neck in Katowice, and we said we would do $200 billion over 5 years together with our partners in IFC. But we at the bank, we commit to $100 billion, of which half would go for adaptation, half for mitigation. So this is about $10 billion a year over 5 years to help communities and countries build resilience so they can be a safer place for their people, but also more productive and competitive economically. We are going to be concentrating on a variety of actions, but I want to lift to your attention 3. Social protection programs. Make sure that when drought is coming or floods are about to hit, there is social protection to those that are most vulnerable. We know how to do that. How many of you are bank staff? Okay, good, excellent. So how many of you believe that the World Bank is the best institution when it comes down to protecting the most vulnerable, doing social protection? Okay, let me see, Just a tiny bit fewer than the first time around. So our social protection colleagues have work to do there. But this is something we know. This is our bread and butter. We know how to do it. We ought to do it when it comes down to the topic of adaptation. And we are committing to do it in 40 countries. This is our clear commitment. Then we want to finance meteorological services. It is just so much better to have accurate weather forecasts so you can take appropriate action at every level. People would not die from summer heat if we had the accurate information. And then focus on climate-smart agriculture and also on climate-smart coastal areas, coastal cities. I love one part of this commitment, which is help nature to help people. Mangroves, coral reefs, help them be healthy, good for them, good for protection of communities. On the second pillar, what we want to deploy is our ability to talk to ministers of finance and planning and make sure that they integrate across the board in countries adaptation in everything from physical infrastructure to social infrastructure to water supply, transport, schools and hospitals. And then what we want to have is a new rating system to make it so that investment in adaptation is being lifted up. Right now, mitigation carries more weight. $1 in mitigation, $1 counted for climate action. In adaptation, we are in a different place. We have to fix that. And let me finish with my third point for today. I am very proud of the staff of the bank over the last years. Not only our climate team, but across the board. Mainstreaming climate action at the World Bank has been happening. And we would make it so that it would happen even more. For that, we have our partners, and Andrew Steer is here as one of them. And we have a great platform to showcase how good we are, the Global Commission on Adaptation that I have the privilege to co-chair. So off we go, get more done. And then we can say we bring good to the world on an issue that is so incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristalina. Very inspirational. Let me now invite Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the World Resources Institute, to share a bit the view on the adaptation, the importance of adaptation. Thank you, Andrew.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Kristalina. Thank all of you. Read this great strategy. How far you have come. I used to work at the World Bank. And one of the most formative experiences of my life took place when I was a very young economist living in the resident office in Indonesia in the mid-80s. And the resident office in Indonesia were basically all white foreign men that were running it. The president of the World Bank visited. And Indonesia then, I believe, was the only developing country in the world that had a cabinet-level environment minister. And his name was Emil Salim. And he met the president of the World Bank at an event. And he said, Mr. President, I wonder if you could help me, because I'm a member of the cabinet, but nobody really listens to me. You're meeting the entire cabinet tomorrow. I wonder if you could just say how great it is that Indonesia has a Minister of Environment, and how great it would be if other countries would do the same. I was in that meeting, and the president of the World Bank said, I'm very sorry, Minister. We're a development agency. We don't do the environment. You'd need help from them. You'd need help from an environmental organization, not from a development agency. And at that moment, I realized what an amazing tragedy development economics had got itself into. It was still 5 years at that stage before the World Bank had an environment department. Now we have a CEO and an acting president who in an earlier life was director of that department. How brilliant that is. Now, I have read this document, and I'd like you to put your hand up here if you have read it all. I noticed the front they have, so you know, but the back they're telling the truth. So, look, I like this strategy a lot. You know, money, mainstream, measure. That is right. I also like the 6 nexuses that you describe. That is right. It's complicated, but it's necessary. You know, adaptation is not particularly new, even in climate change. In 2001, the UNFCCC COP and also IPCC put out a big report. Adaptation needs to be taken seriously. But it really wasn't. And partly the environmental movement is to blame for that. Because we were saying, don't invest too much in adaptation because people might think you don't need to mitigate. Not that there weren't some great examples. So go to Bangladesh or go to Rwanda, look at the agriculture there, go to Colombia, go to the Netherlands, go to many of the small island developing states. They're good at this. But the plain fact of the matter is it is not adding up. There's not the political leadership we need. There's not a narrative that inspires political leaders. It's regarded as complicated, multi-sectoral, multi-ministerial. It requires investing now for long-term gains, and what politician wants to do that? And not really any metrics, quite frankly, as to how resilient a country is. And so we need to change that. This document is part of that changing, and it's precisely why now there is a global commission on adaptation. Thank you, Netherlands, for setting that up. And thank you to the other 16 heads of state who are supporting that. 16 heads of state. Mr. Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi, Theresa May, if she's still, well, she is still, and they're doing a very good job on this, by the way. So that was a slip. They had a vote today in Parliament that you may have heard about. 17 heads of state, including some of the most important small island developing states, all supporting 3 co-chairs, Kristalina Georgieva, Bill Gates, and Ban Ki-moon. I mean, not too shabby, eh? And even if you look at the commissioners, you've got the president of the Marshall Islands, the prime minister of Grenada, you've got Christiana Figueres, you've got a whole range of the influential in this space. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure there is a narrative that really sings to leaders. Think about mitigation. Think about the 3 phases that we've gone through in understanding mitigation. Phase 1 was, it'd be nice to do something about climate change, but it's going to cost us, and there's a trade-off. Phase 2 was, hey, we can do something about climate change, and actually it doesn't hurt economic development too much. Phase 3, which we're now in, is if you want to have economic development and you want to have your SDGs, you had better act on climate change. We need that same 3 phases for adaptation, and that is exactly what this is all about. I love this notion of we need to do development differently. And we've got to say that the development community has, over the last 50 years, lived in straight lines and smooth curves. And the reality is that's not reality. The reality is that systems get shocked. The one thing we can be sure about is that something will go wrong. And yet we've designed our systems on the assumption that everything will just keep going fine. So the Global Commission on Adaptation is going to precisely struggle with these issues, trying to demonstrate, and I believe will demonstrate, that actually good adaptation will lead to better poverty reduction, better economic growth, better jobs, precisely as this report is here. I think we have the co-director, is Christina Chen here in the room. If anybody wants to meet her, she's down here. Anand here is the Chief Research Director of the Commission. And I don't know whether Patrick Vercoyen is not here. I think you all know him. At the moment, we've been asked as the World Resources Institute, together with the brand new Center for Global Adaptation in Rotterdam, to be the managing partners of this exercise. So I would like to commend you all for this. $50 billion spent the way you're planning to spend it will improve the lives not only of tens of millions of people who are alive today, but hundreds of millions of people who will be alive in future generations. Thank you very much indeed.
ahin a garin Madugu. Dangance da munin da duka mutanenmu na nan karkara, zaman noman nan ne da kiwo, da inda sun ka samu tabarbarewa, to kwancan kalin babu ta.
Ay minan tabu na pain kiribes. Ay ro na mekin ki kanga narin ya bisin tari kanga yer. Ita ben ke na ko yaite citan wo sakro ataya be ina to kin ngai na ko tamin na pere.
Lokacin da muka tasa tunda abubuwan da muke da mun kasa su basi.
Aria ponsa ne rotera tari aria ponye kina kwon na pin anere kanga rigin dirigai kana ya buntuen nen tari ka mani po sipun rota ki yai pangaira yai nasira aura masata yai tene nera nanni ki sepo ya katwa wiki aura kiya
sai ka kana jingiran ga zaka tsallace ka da iyalinka to har na ta na bar su hankali na ba shi kwance kullum ina cikin lissafin mi na baro bayana
Silang kakainan wa teran naroon tetepo-tepo tekuka. Kain ka bene sikenin kainan mi menteran. Angaya te kinakarin ang dokot tepam. Masa tayo sinimaro alun.
Labarin proje mun same daga kwamitin mu ta Kwarnaka. Aka ce wani proje ya zo ana ce mishi Faka RC. Sun ba mu iri mai sauri, sun ba mu rogo. Yanzu ko da rayuwa ta zan halin yau. Yana tare da iyalina na ga sun ka ce ni kan kana hankali na ya kwanta hiye da da.
Naroon ti ora ki kanga ay saka ka. Ay may kunan ka para. Sa punlagi kunan ni mga raronan nararan pare. Ya punikahan.
Gonakana na rogo dai eka 2 da rabi ne. Dan ka sa rogo shi kenan sai zai gaba da rayuwar shi. Yanzu cikin bisa ribar na samu bisa wanga fanni na wanga noman rogo da wanga noma iri mai gaugawa nan. To yanzu bakin gwargwado duk irin matsalolin aka cikin kala ga yanzu masan kwanan su. Shi wanga iri mai gaugawa. Gudunmawa ta da gance da karamcin ruwa mutane an kusa mace magana a ta diga an kusa mace wannan wuri.
Naroon bibitakin ni kanwani po yon na tera kiribes. Sinariyain ngaira ikiribes inda nangoy kaangangan ni katen. Ayan naroon na nga sinunoriya.
Sauran karan da aka gare daga sauran mutane na duniya su tabbatar da akwai canji yanayi ya zo ne da kanshi ba sako bane ya zo da kanshi ne. Kenan yanzu ya kamata mu da muka gani muna ta kowa da wanga abu. Kowa shi kashe kwance da ba a rikewa da wanga canji yanayi ana rikewa gare shi an ta tsaye.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aram Tall, and I'm the team leader for the Adaptation and Resilience Action Plan. First off, I'd like to recognize the hard work of all those folks who've made this action plan today a reality. Most of them are seated on the first 2 to 3 rows of this room, and I hope that you can please join me in recognizing all of their hard work. As our CEO, Kristalina, mentioned earlier, adaptation is truly about people. It's about the folks who we've just seen on the video, and it's about these people that we've selected as the cover photo for the action plan, who are in Saint-Louis, Senegal, and as we speak, who are sinking under rising sea levels. The action plan aims to serve them and their client governments to make them better equipped to face a new climate reality, a reality that is marked today by increasingly variable climate, by more and more erratic weather patterns, and a reality which communities, cities, and businesses across the globe are already dealing with, but will need to continue bracing for more of as we edge closer to planetary tipping points. One might ask, how will we get this done? Kristalina mentioned already the 3 pillars of the action plan. I'll give you a few more examples of innovative practices that the plan advocates for. First, we will build our internal capacity to better serve client governments to mainstream adaptation into everything that we do. Internally, we will establish a climate support facility that will deliver expertise, finance, best available climate information services, as well as guidance notes on how to do more on adaptation and design projects successfully with an adaptation component. All global practices of the World Bank Group will have to be actively engaged in this endeavor. Second, we plan to fully engage World Bank macroeconomists, poverty specialists, as well as governance specialists to be able to support countries, ministries of finance and planning in particular, to upstream engage all of the different risks that a country faces and make sure that they're systematically incorporated into poverty diagnostics, debt sustainability analysis, public expenditure reviews, and the suite of different tools that the World Bank supports at country level. Third, we will scale up effective adaptation practices that have been time-tested and ground-proven to work. This will include promoting cross-sector solutions in areas where action spans country, region, or transboundary scales. Examples include integrated coastal zone management or landscape management, which we'll hear more about shortly from our colleagues. I'd encourage you, as Andrew and Christelina did before, to read the full action plan for more technical details. Finally, and this gets us all very excited, we plan to work with IFC and MIGA more proactively to engage the private sector, because they are learning, as we are, on how to address climate risks more proactively as part of their distribution lines and value chains. Engaging them proactively will entail us applying our Maximizing Finance for Development, MFD, approach to engage the private sector financing in adaptation. And all of this, ladies and gentlemen, we plan to do while keeping the focus on the needs of the most vulnerable. Because at the end of the day, adaptation is ultimately local. Now, many of our colleagues in the room today have already been working on these issues for multiple years. I'm very pleased and proud to invite them to the stage to join us to showcase and highlight multiple activities and projects that are already, across the World Bank Group, advancing what we propose in the action plan. Please join me in welcoming to the stage, first, Peter Christensen, who will provide us with a very exciting project that is already going on now on West Africa's coastline to promote Nexus solutions. Peter, would you please join me on stage?
Thank you, Aram, and good afternoon. My name is Peter Christensen. I am a coastal geomorphologist, and I'll tell you about the West Africa Coastal Areas Program, or WACA as we call it. Well, let me start with this picture. This is Mr. Efove from Togo. Look at what he's leaning against. What do you think that is? What do you think that is? Well, that is, believe it or not, the well that was in his compound. His house was lost to coastal erosion. So coastal erosion is a visible result of very unsustainable coastal zone management. It happens because large infrastructure, like ports, prevent the natural flow of sediment along the coast. Also, there's been a rampant mining of sand for construction, and this is not going to help the countries very much. So it is a regional challenge because any mitigation effort in one country will actually affect the neighboring country. The economic cost of this coastal degradation is staggering. In 2017, in just 4 of the countries in West Africa, the cost from erosion, flooding, and pollution was $3.3 billion, or 5% of their GDP. The social implications is significant as well. In Saint Louis, Senegal, a World Heritage Site, thousands of people will need to be relocated to safer grounds in the coming years. So with sea level rise and extreme weather, more than ever, adaptation is needed. So we created WACA, West Africa Coastal Areas Program, and it's a quite neat setup where we take advantage of all of the bank's mechanisms for finance. We have a $200 million regional project that is benefiting countries and regional institutions. We're using the IDA 18 regional integration window because of the scale, the magnitude of the problem, and the complexity. But $200 million is not going to be enough, clearly. So we also set aside money for a programmatic technical assistance program that will set up a platform that will enable countries to access knowledge and finance at the scale needed. So partners really like the WACA approach because it leverages their resources. We already have about 12 partners interested in providing in finance and another 12 interested in providing knowledge and expertise. Internally, we have, of course, an excellent group of colleagues in different practices. We have engaged transport and education and social and climate and many more, and the IFC too, to get the job done. And we hope that they will all join forces and really give this a good push. So looking ahead, we'll be fixing dunes, constructing sea defense, restoring mangroves, and spurring innovation in ports, for example. Working with the Africa Centers of Excellence, we'll be building the capacity of the new young people who will be the practitioners in adaptation in the future. But most importantly, we'll be financing social and livelihood projects to benefit people like Mr. Efove in Togo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for introducing us to Mr. Efove and all the wonderful work that the WACA project is doing. I'd like to now invite our second Ignite speaker, Alyssa Baroody, who will give us more information on what effective adaptation looks like in Niger. Ellie, over to you.
Thank you, Aram. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alyssa Baroody. I'm a lead natural resource management specialist in Africa. I'm presenting on behalf of the Niger team. Ladies and gentlemen, when we think of Niger's environment, what do we think of? An arid landscape, poverty, high population rates, migration, tough conditions. Climate change has exacerbated many of these, but Niger has taken significant steps to improve conditions for people and for land, as you have seen earlier in the video and in the project I'm going to highlight. But in addition, millions of hectares of land have been rehabilitated. Millions of dollars are invested in climate-smart agriculture, and Niger has also persevered successfully on a mitigation project and is the first country in a fragile conflict and violent context in Africa to deliver and get paid for carbon. Niger has many strategic plans and initiatives for adaptation, such as the Nigerians Nourish Nigerians program and its own socioeconomic development plan. The challenge was how to implement these. So one program I want to talk about is the $100 million program of the pilot program for climate resilience. Niger has focused significantly on land use adaptation measures at both national and decentralized levels. These efforts have been championed by the Ministry of Planning, but with many other ministries alongside, including environment, agriculture, livestock, land use planning, and community development. In other words, they formed a true partnership for multi-sectoral collaboration. At the decentralized level, a program for strengthening resilience of both the productive systems in Niger to achieve food security, but also for resilience of communities, is underway in what is one of the poorest countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Has there been transformational change? Yes. For instance, over 33,000 hectares of agriculture and pasture land has benefited from improved adaptation measures and sustainable land and water management practices. There's been an increase, for example, of 67% in crop yields and 39% in forage yields in these particular areas of intervention. Challenges remain, but the approach is being scaled up, and Niger is rolling out an integrated service platform known as the Maison du Paysan, farmers' houses, where adaptation activities are being scaled up and replicated in even more communes. So Niger is also planning on taking its efforts using technology to speed up this development and is integrating into these platforms mobile phone data use, for example, for early warning systems, weather and climate-smart agriculture, but also satellite imagery for more detailed planning purposes. So, ladies and gentlemen, the scaling up of land use practices is happening, and this is going to lead to even more development impacts for the communities of Niger. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellie. From Niger, we now go to the Philippines, where Stephen Ling will provide us a concrete example of how mainstreaming adaptation works.
Thank you, Ren. The Philippines is extraordinarily vulnerable to climate impacts. For example, more tropical cyclones make landfall there than any other country except China, and the damage that they inflict is increasing. However, the country is also serious about investing in climate resilience. With assistance from the bank, the Department of Budget Management has been tracking climate budget allocations, and as the overall state budget has grown, so has expenditure on adaptation. But while the Philippines is spending more than it ever has on climate resilience, it's still not enough to address all the many challenges faced or use as effectively as it could be. Several climate-smart planning tools have been developed for local governments, but these plans typically lack funding and don't automatically feed into national agencies' programs. And there are major gaps in current spending in relation to the needs, including low budgets for coastal defense, for climate-smart agriculture, and water security. Existing national investment programs don't always prioritize or maximize potential adaptation benefits, and there are no mechanisms to capture synergies between different agencies' efforts or to measure overall progress in adaptation between the different agencies. So, how do you invest in resilience in a way that links local needs to the national budget? Many things count as investments in adaptation, but what counts the most? How do you measure and maximize climate resilience? The Philippines is building systems to address this. The Department of Budget Management has promoted a process called convergence budgeting to tackle key multi-sectoral challenges. Convergence budgeting brings different agencies together to work towards common objectives. In the case of climate resilience, the Risk Resiliency Program is developing climate adaptation convergence budgeting so that different agencies' resilience investments add up to more than the sum of their parts and will increasingly be based on local information and planning. This process involves integrating local climate risk information into standardized resilience diagnostics and investment portfolios, a review and approval process that brings together provincial and national government units to identify programs that can provide solutions to local needs, quality assurance, cabinet-level endorsement, and special budget hearings to increase allocations to programs that contribute to agreed adaptation priorities, and process and impact monitoring for the Convergence Budget Program. The Risk Resiliency Program is still in development, but it has already demonstrated a shared commitment by budget, planning, and line agencies to tackling climate change. Small incremental investments in coordination, quality control, and monitoring could yield large and measurable dividends in cost-effective adaptation and better equip local communities to face the multiplying climate challenges in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We now turn to Margaret Arnold, who will provide us with a concrete example of how one can get finance into the hands of those most impacted.
Thanks, Aram. Hello, I'm Margaret Arnold. I'm a senior social development specialist in the Climate Group, and I'm going to tell you about the bank's secret weapon for advancing climate change adaptation and making effective use of that $50 billion that Kristalina just told you about. $50 billion is a nice chunk of change. So how do we make sure we get the most bang for our buck? And how do we help all of the poor communities that are already experiencing the impacts of climate change? From years of partnering with grassroots communities, we've learned that we can best help them by recognizing and elevating the expertise they've gained through years of managing multiple risks. And we can work with them as partners, not just beneficiaries, and connect them to the additional resources and knowledge that they need to manage risk in a way that responds to their own priorities. So what does this look like? It looks like the Basho Project, where communities in Japan, Nepal, and the Philippines are learning from each other that elders and persons with disabilities can lead recovery, teach younger generations about managing future risk, and help keep each other safe in times of crisis. And it looks like Central America, where grassroots women's organizations are developing and using risk maps to negotiate resources from their local authorities. Their success has been recognized and formalized by the Central America Disaster Agency, the Regional Disaster Prevention Agency, and they are now certified and training other local authorities to work with indigenous communities on managing climate risk. So these are just two examples, but we need to do this at a global scale. Our secret weapon to do this is community-driven development, or CDD. Many of you have probably heard of it because we've been doing it for decades. CDD is a proven, efficient mechanism to get resources directly to communities, to target excluded groups, and to give people more voice and choice because they're saying where the money's going to go. Over the past decade, the bank has invested more than $30 billion in CDD programs and approaches. And when we looked at how much of that went to climate adaptation, we found that over $1 billion a year was going to climate and disaster resilience activities. That's $1 billion a year in the hands of communities with decision-making power to strengthen resilience. And now we have the opportunity to take this to a whole new level. We can harness the power of CDD to distribute climate finance. We could work with our clients to help them partner with communities to tap into the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, the superior risk management skills of women, the energy of youth, the perspective and experience of persons with disabilities, all to devise sustainable and inclusive solutions. So just think about that for a minute and try to not let your mind be blown. You can't do it. Your minds are blown now. So the really exciting news is that we're already heading down this path. Through a partnership with Social Development and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, we have a social resilience program that provides the financial and technical resources to integrate climate and disaster resilience into CDD programs and other activities that empower communities. We've been doing this in about 10 countries so far, and we're looking to do much more so that we get to the 78 countries where CDD is operational and we can expand it to more. So CDD is a proven and powerful weapon that can channel a big chunk of that $50 billion directly to the local level where the climate change impacts are being felt and where the solutions need to come from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that inspirational segment on how one can focus on the most vulnerable. The examples you've seen illustrate what adaptation looks like and how we can scale it up today, collectively, to ensure that all countries scale up their climate risk management practices. Now, one obstacle we faced as we tried to promote this agenda has been how is it that we measure progress and not just process. I'm pleased to now invite to join us on stage Stéphane Algat, who will illustrate how the World Bank is committing to scale up our resilience rating system. Stéphane.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. So you have heard today about the ambitious goals that we have as part of this climate change action plan. And with such ambitious goals, it's absolutely critical that we can monitor our progress closely year after year. And we're already doing a lot to track the quality of our project, regardless of their objectives. But as you know, and it has been mentioned already, monitoring resilience is particularly challenging. So in that case, we need something new, we need something innovative. What I will talk about now is a resilience rating system that is under development and will be designed to track the quality of our project along two different dimensions. The first one is the resilience of our project, which is their ability to deliver the development gains we expect from them in spite of climate change and natural disasters. And there is a second dimension, which is the resilience through our project. How much resilience are we creating for beneficiaries, communities, countries with those projects? So let me start with this first dimension with an example, those two bridges. If we or anybody invests in a bridge like that, one big question is whether the bridge has been designed and assessed taking into account climate risks and natural disasters, and whether it can cope with changing climate conditions. And of course, this information does exist. It's in project documents, but it's highly technical. It's not easy to know if the quality of the assessment is appropriate. And very few decision makers and investors have the time and skills to look into the assessment itself and decide if it has been done properly. So we propose something very simple. A rating system with just one letter that tells investors and decision makers whether the risk assessment and the design of the project has been done properly. So if you have a C and an A+, you know that if you invest in the A+ project, you're much less likely to meet underperformance and to have bad social, human, or economic outcomes out of your project. So a very simple tool to just guide decision-making and investment. But this is not enough. We have the second dimension, the resilience through our project. Because the most resilient bridge in the world might do very little to build the resilience of a community if it's not located in the right place, for instance. So we want to also look at the outcomes of the project and how much they contribute to the resilience of the beneficiaries. So if you have two slum upgrading projects, probably both of them build the resilience of beneficiaries. But if the second one has some specific interventions that reduce future climate change impacts or build resilience, then it needs to be prioritized. Again, we're not inventing any new data or information. It's all in the project documents, but it's not easy to extract and interpret. So again, we have one letter to help decision makers make their choices and prioritize the projects that do the most to build resilience. This tool is under development. We're doing that with many experts from the World Bank Group, but also many partners from the public and private sector. And when operational, we can use this tool to monitor our portfolio and look at how we do more and we do better. But we also hope that this tool can contribute to a global standard used by financial markets and public procurements everywhere so that it influences investments way beyond the World Bank Group and changes all investments to make sure they contribute to a more resilient future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stéphane, and thank you to all of our Ignite presenters from today. Please join me in a final round of applause for them. We hope that the experiences that they have related today provide inspiration to each and every one of us as we reflect on how we can do more on adaptation for people on the ground as part of our daily jobs in our individual work plans. We're done with this Ignite segment. I'm now pleased to pass it back to Laura, Kristalina, Christine, and Andrew. Thank you very much.
Great. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to kick off this part of the conversation with a few questions to each of our speakers, and then we'll take questions, both the ones that have come in online and if there are any from the floor. So let me start with you, Kristalina. You talked about big numbers as far as the money goes, 200 billion, 100 billion from the bank, 50 billion for adaptation. But that's not remotely how much we need. So how do we go about motivating or generating additional support from partners and others into this agenda?
Before I answer, would you agree with me that my guys rock those who were making the presentations? They do. How we make the case for systematic approach to adaptation and a massively increasing communities and countries' ability to rely on financing. My answer is as follows. One, Mother Nature helps. What we have seen in recent years is demonstrably the impact of a changing climate across the world, but in particular in countries and communities that are most vulnerable to hurricanes, floods, droughts, heat waves. And that is now calculated to be a dramatic step up impact on the national economies and on the global economy. We heard the 5% GDP number just from the impact on the coastal communities under the WACA program. Last year alone, it costed the world $320 billion because of weather-related and to a degree climate-induced disasters. While it is true we cannot quite pin it, what is just a disaster and what is exacerbated because of climate change, we do have very clear science, the latest IPCC report. So we have to recognize that these numbers are going up, and we also know, by and large, $1 invested in prevention and resilience, $4 saved in disasters. And we have a responsibility as an institution to do the math and to amplify this message, and then demonstrate the cost-benefit of investing in resilience systematically. Two, we have a responsibility to lead. I strongly believe that World Bank investments in adaptation are going to lead to a spillover impact of national investments, and when we do it, very often we see an increase in that direction by other development organizations. So we have to be very strongly aligned internally, and we also have to be demonstrating that impact systematically externally. As you know, Laura, I expect that our vice presidents, directors, our senior staff across the institution is, for the service to development, capable and consistently promoting adaptation in what we do. And three, we have an obligation to participate in external processes and fora actively, and be sure that we amplify the voices of people who depend on global action on climate, both on mitigation, but also as much on adaptation. So to just sum it up, make the case systematically, demonstrate through our action, engage actively externally, so we get a significant increase, especially in terms of private investments in adaptation. Wait a second. Give me one. I just want to say one more thing to all of us. We also have an obligation to innovate in terms of financial instruments. Remember the green bonds we invented? I think time has come for resilience bonds. We invented insurance. I think time has come up to scale it up. So no stone to be left unturned.
Great, thank you, Kristalina. I like to say, why would we do anything that isn't climate resilient? And with your leadership, you'll get the bank there. For those of you who don't know her, I'd like to introduce our executive director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean, Christine Hogan. Thank you, Christine, for joining us. So maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about what you're seeing already of climate impacts in the Caribbean. And while we're doing a lot, and we have a big program there, what more do we need to do? What would you like to tell this audience you'd like to see us, how to step up our game there?
Great. Well, thank you, Laura. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the conversation today. And congratulations to the team behind the scenes and for the presentations today. This is a very important step for the bank to put adaptation so forthrightly out there as part of the bank's strategy on climate change. And I think it will be a very important action plan that I know your shareholders will read with tremendous interest. So I represent 11 Caribbean countries, not all of the Caribbean, but 11. And for those countries, for my authorities, this is not a new conversation. This is a topic and an issue that they've been engaged with for some time now. And I have to say that in my position as executive director, despite coming to the bank from Canada, I have definitely come to appreciate what it looks like to be on the front lines of an issue like climate change. The reality is that the impacts that are felt on climate change, some, you know, are on the front pages of the paper and consume our media for days on end as hurricanes mount and the impacts are felt. And here I can talk about one of the countries in my constituency, Dominica, who in 2017 faced Hurricane Maria, and the day after learned what a loss of 226% of their GDP looks like. These are more frequent and more intense, these episodes and these storms for countries across the Caribbean region. I had a chance to visit Dominica many months after, and the impacts on the housing stock, the productive agricultural sector, the infrastructure is profound, and it takes months, if not longer, to recoup and recover and get back on track. But there's also a quieter set of impacts for climate change that warrant our attention, and as we think more about adaptation and resilience. And a lot of them came through in the presentations. The more erratic rainfall patterns that affect the agricultural sectors across the Caribbean islands, the flooding, landslides that come again with more erratic rainfall, rising sea temperatures, rising sea levels that are impacting coral reefs and by consequence impacting tourism sectors, which are really the livelihoods of many of these economies. Coastal erosion, impacts on livelihoods and vulnerable populations, and I was very pleased to see that dimension of the discussion came through in the presentations as well. So that's a flavor of what our governments across the Caribbean are dealing with. As I said, this is not a new conversation, but it is one that is getting more and more attention. And I would just hearken back a couple of months to what I thought was a very important conference that was convened jointly by the bank, by the IMF, and by the Inter-American Development Bank on building Caribbean resilience to climate and natural disasters. And it was more than 200 participants. Many heads of government participated. And it was really a chance for the Caribbean region to take stock and to really think about what I see as three big questions. One is the issue around preparedness. You know, this is the point was made about the extent to which governments and countries are internalizing the climate risk and the disaster risk management into their national strategies, and I think we're seeing more of this. The second is around the actual toolkit. And here I think the Caribbean has been doing some excellent work. The CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, which is known to many and has had wonderful transferability into other parts of the world, but more focus on the financial toolkit and the financial instruments. And the third is, of course, the focus on the vulnerability, the adaptive social safety nets. I would simply say that what I think is happening now is a more holistic conversation about all of these features as countries try to internalize their adaptation and their plans. And the final piece that I think is also worth noting, Laura, is the work that the bank is doing with the IMF on climate change policy assessments, which allow countries to also think about what their economies need to be tackling this notion of ex-ante focus on climate and climate resilience, and I think those are very important issues that that suggest some new dimensions to the conversation. So, all in all, this is a conversation that's going to continue for as long as we're here, I think. But I just think that today's launch of this plan will create a new focus for the bank, a sharpened focus for the bank to continue the already very considerable efforts in countries that are really directly impacted by climate change.
Great, thank you. We know the Caribbean is particularly vulnerable, and thank you for putting the emphasis on planning and preparedness. That's great. Now, I think most people in this room would understand the motivation for adaptation for agricultural coastal zones or residential or urban infrastructure, water. But Andrew, how can you motivate us to get excited about a rating system? Why is it so important? We just heard from Stefan, but can you tell us a little bit why we might see this as fundamental to our work going forward?
Well, first, all of those 5 presentations were terrific. I guess the answer to that question is look at the cost of doing business survey. Great article in The Economist last month that said that now, all around the world, governments are setting up units to manage their cost of doing business. Look, what we don't measure, we don't treasure, and what we don't treasure, we won't manage, and what we don't manage, we won't improve. And one of the banes of adaptation has been the lack of metrics. We can measure tons of carbon. We have a target of 1.5 to 2 degrees. People can get their heads around it. Politicians can too. They have no idea when it comes to resilience. So well done, Stefan. This is a good idea. Now, I would say this, having been very nice to you. Number one, nobody should get any credit for a bridge that is resilient. You know, I mean, if we're building bridges today that are not resilient, please leave the World Bank. So maybe for others' bridges, fine. But so no stars for resilience, not through, resilience of. Now, the really valuable part of the analysis is the resilience through. And there is no institution on the planet that is better equipped to have the kinds of conversations that are necessary than the World Bank to get resilience through, because you need ministers of planning, you need heads of state, you need ministers of finance. You guys can do it. So that's what we will be looking at. And incidentally, I believe that the Commission on Adaptation should take your ideas, and we should, as part of the action track, you know, we're going to deliver the report, well, Kristalina and Bill Gates and Ban Ki-moon are going to deliver the report to the Secretary General at the Climate Summit in September and launch a year of action. And in that year of action, there'll be 5 or 6 strands, and one of them should be to implement this. My second point, though, is next year, when we have a meeting like this, I believe we'll go to the next stage, which I think is more important, which is actually how we measure resilience. This is how you measure resilience of a project, but actually what about a resilience of a city or a community or a sector or a country? And people would say, oh, it's much too difficult. I mean, it's so location specific and, you know, we just don't, it would be impossible. Well, that's exactly what they said about banking 25 years ago. You know, how resilient is your balance sheet in a bank or a fund? Well, it's very complicated, depends upon this, this, this. Well, now we have something called a stress test. Every major financial institution in most major countries is obliged to do that. And what is a stress test? A stress test is simply you shock the system with a bunch of sort of bad-looking, multiplying, interrelated shocks. We've got that in climate change, where we know it's to do with, you know, higher temperatures, it's worse storms, it's rising sea level, it's acidification of the ocean, it's the hydrological cycles that shift. We actually know quite a bit about how they interact with each other. start shocking the systems at a city level, at a sectoral level, and so on. My goodness me, what a difference that would make if we had a rating of cities, if we had a rating of sectors, a rating of even countries, my word, then you would start getting politicians to take this seriously. So that's for next year's meeting.
Thank you, Andrew. Gives incentives policymakers also to private investors, I guess, to understand the resilience of their investment. So very helpful, and hopefully we'll have something by next year. So I'm going to open it up now to people who want to ask questions, and while you're formulating things in your mind, we're getting questions rolling in online. So if anybody wants to go to the microphone, that's fine. I'm going to start with you, Kristalina, though. There's a question to you from David in Canada, who is asking what he says is a simple and straightforward question. Why do you want to adapt to climate change rather than solve the problem?
Well, we used to have a president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, and his favorite phrase was that we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to fight with all we have the risk of climate change accelerating beyond what we know is a safe level, 1.5 degree. Andrew has a pin that says 1.5 is the max we should have. At the same time, even with 1.5, there are already clearly impacts on the way we function that require to have communities, countries, individuals, families to be more resilient. And what is, Andrew was the name? No, David, okay. David, I am absolutely determined that all we do in development ought to be low carbon and climate resilient. So we are not trading between those two, we are just facing the reality that a more resilient world in the face of climate change is a must. And the countries that are more at risk very often are, unfortunately, countries that have done very little or nothing to contribute to climate change, but are faced with its consequences, and we saw some of them on the screen today. So walk and chew gum at the same time.
I don't see anybody lined up at the microphones, so I'm still waiting. I'll move. The next question has come in from Doumbia Bakary in Mali. Andrew, I'll turn this one to you, which says, well, and any of you can answer this if you want, but climate adaptation is a great way to protect people against climate catastrophes. Are the current technologies adequate to reach those objectives? Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the technological innovation that you've seen to help with adaptation?
Well, many of the technologies are there already, and many of them are simple. I remember, Kristalina, when we did the first press conference for the Adaptation Commission, you talked about how the farming systems are changing from chickens to ducks so they can swim. I mean, that's a sort of silly example of what you do when there are floods, but actually quite a lot of them are quite simple. I lived 5 years in Vietnam. The first month I was there, typhoon killed, I think, like 1,000 people. That typhoon today would probably kill about 20 people. One of the reasons is they decided to build 2-story schools. So, I mean, it's not very sophisticated, and they now even have ramps up so you can take your animals up into the second. So a lot of the technologies are, but there are many technologies we don't have yet, and that's why one of the reasons Bill Gates wanted, he's never ever joined a commission before, and he agreed to co-chair this partly because he believes that actually we need technologies, especially for food security and agriculture. So it's a combination. But one of the things, one of the action tracks of the commission, which Kristalina I know has been very involved in, so I see here all kinds of people like John and others on the front row, where the World Bank will play a big role, is in the research agenda for new technologies, particularly for the rural space.
Yeah, a lot of things we've been doing on water-saving devices and the hydromet and using drones to restore degraded land and all kinds of things that we need to scale up to tackle the agenda. But now I see we're getting some excitement from the floor. So let me invite, oh, we got quite a line. Good, so why don't you tell us your name and where you're from and who your question's to.
Sure. I'm Peter Schultz, I'm with ICF. I wanted to begin by commending the World Bank for this undertaking. It strikes me as the world's most ambitious effort to increase the resilience of the people that are most in need, and I wanted to thank you for that. The question is, what is the World Bank thinking about in terms of really unleashing the financial force of both the private sector and communities to make the massive investments which have the potential to far exceed the depth of the World Bank's pocketbooks by building or helping them understand and build and communicate the business case, because that money isn't going to be unlocked unless they see what the return on that investment is going to be. And we see that in our own work for both the private sector and in localities. So I'm curious to hear how the World Bank is thinking about helping potential funders understand and build and communicate the business case.
Why don't I let all of you, Ede, why don't you go ahead and...
Sure, Ede Iyas from the Social Urban Rural Land Resilience Global Practice. Andrew, you didn't talk too much about nature, and my sense is that as climate starts becoming an overwhelming reality, the only buffer we're going to have is nature. The largest buffer ever is nature. We're not going to be able to build resilience. We will need to use nature to help us survive in very practical ways. Thoughts on WRI, from WRI on how we need to bring nature to the center of this discussion altogether, how cities need to protect their wetlands as the most important resource, the coastal cities or mangroves. All those kind of dimensions will be, your thoughts on that, we'd love to hear.
Hi, Christina Chan. Co-direct the Global Commission on Adaptation. I want to thank you, Kristalina, for your leadership for the Commission. And something that, Andrew, you started off by saying, the story about being in Indonesia and the comment about the divide between development and environment. And one of the three major thrusts of the adaptation plan being about mainstreaming and really getting adaptation out of not just the environment silo but and the climate silo, but getting it into the way finance ministries, planning ministries, agriculture, water, health, those sectors think about adaptation and incorporate it into the way they do business, to do development differently. How, it's connected to the first question about why aren't we solving the problem? And I think that's a perpetual challenge we face in the adaptation community, that adaptation is not on the agenda in the way it should be at the global level. So Christine, my question to you as one of the leads of the Global Commission on Adaptation, what do we need to do? How can we leverage the Global Commission to really galvanize that global leadership, to really raise the agenda of adaptation in the development sectors? Thanks.
Good, and then Christine, there was a question from Lebo in South Africa about planning and management and how it can actually improve investments for adaptation. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, where you've seen it working, making a difference in the Caribbean. So let's just go down the line then, and each of you can answer the question that was addressed to you or anything else you're inspired to answer.
Thank you very much, Laura. Let me start with the question on how to make the financial case, the business case for adaptation, so the business community can see something for them. And there are many dimensions, but let me concentrate on three. One is enhancement of productivity and therefore returns. Very clearly in agriculture, climate-smart agriculture is also more productive and higher return agriculture. Water resource management could have a very good business case, building barriers to disasters, very attractive for financing. I always think of the Dutch that live under sea level, And of course, Dutch companies are leading companies in that area of adaptation. So there is business, and of course, among the industries that are particularly interested, insurance industry. Boy, do these guys want to get this to be on the agenda of every policy maker. So there is this productivity slash sectoral advancement aspect, and of course, work is to be done to make it more visible, make the case more clearly. The second area is standards. What I believe we can also contribute to is by introducing standards from construction to sectoral requirements, and again, agriculture comes to mind, but it's not just agriculture, transport, energy. You can make the case there. When we introduce standards, they immediately, they lead to business response. Take, for example, something that is not just climate change. It is the same in also in terms of earthquakes. In the housing stock, when you put standards, they lead to response from industries. I believe there is and the third aspect is being much more aggressive in using mandatory insurance to create the enabling environment for resilience investments. I can tell you that when I was commissioner for, among other things, crisis response and civil protection in Europe, we did produce a green paper on using insurance to insensitize resilient investments. It is still a way to go there, because obviously that leads to all kinds of resistance. But to put it very simply, if we link insurance premium to risk from natural disasters, and then we mandate that insurance is being paid, people are not going to build that much where they shouldn't. And when they do build where they shouldn't, they'll pay through the nose. Again, creating a sort of market signal for behavior. Loss reduction is a very obvious thing, and that takes me to the second question that was kind of addressed more to me. How do you make the case for adaptation? Our problem with adaptation and resilience is that very often the impacts are over a long period of time. You cannot quite connect one thing to another. And as Andrew said, you cannot so easily measure adaptive capacity. It's not like with tons of carbon reduced. And this is what makes it fun, that we actually have to come up with a way that we communicate, and also to the business community, but we communicate why adaptation and resilience are critical. I like Andrew's challenge. Let's gather here next year, same time, same place. Put the date down in your calendar, Andrew. And hopefully we will talk Turkey in terms of creating these matrices and incentives in a different way. I strongly believe the Adaptation Commission would lift this up. It would lift it up. Among other things, we have you guys, we have your teams, and you are creative creatures. Do people know that Andrew, like me, is a former environment director at the World Bank? So we share DNA. But that is basically what I'm going to say, not to be taken as World Bank statement. This is me, Kristalina, talking. I actually believe that everything we do, 100%, has to be climate aligned. Everything we do. And I would throw a question to the skeptics. Tell me why we shouldn't. Make the case against it, when we know that low carbon is also higher competitiveness, and when we know that resilience building is excellent development. 100%. And you, yeah, okay.
Ede, you're unnecessarily humble. Actually, your practice here at the World Bank is doing amazing things using natural capital and nature, if you like. So I would actually like to hear your answer to the question. So the question was, given that the crisis is so great, given that sea levels are rising, given that we know there's going to be worse storms, given that all of these things, we don't have enough money to buy enough concrete to lay to solve the problems. And this is one of the sort of silver linings, if you like, of a bad thing like climate change. It is encouraging us to do things that we should have been doing all the time. It's a bit like energy subsidies. You know, climate change is encouraging leaders who should have abolished energy subsidies years ago to do what they should have done because now the need is so urgent. So yeah, we're finding, I mean, we have a natural capital practice, if you like. We're finding that we're overwhelmed with requests for help. And Christina, who's the co-chair of the Commission, is also director of the resilience practice at WRI. And our water team and her team, you know, are continually asked to help. So this is a good thing, and watch this space because we need to monitor it. And I do believe that we're going to see a real sort of aha moment internationally on this issue of natural capital, so to speak. Just one word on making the business case. I don't think for the large corporate sector, it's difficult now to make a business case that climate is a problem. I mean, look at the 1,000 CEOs that rank risks in the World Economic Forum annual review, and you'll see they are well aware of the problem of water risk. They're well aware of climate risk. We run something called Aqueduct, which looks at the 15,000 river basins in the world and gives all kinds of indicators of risks, and we project water risk into the future. More than 1,000 companies are now using that regularly. So I think the problem is not getting them to be aware, and I think, for example, the Thailand floods a few years ago, which spiked the cost of silicon chips by 60%, has sort of made it so clear to everybody. I think the challenge is getting those big guys to realize it's not just about them sorting out their own supply chains. They actually need to engage with governments because they can't solve it on their own. We need to have just a much, much richer sort of engagement between the corporates, the small scalers, and governments and NGOs, and is that kind of coalition that we need to catalyze as part of this commission, and the bank is again so well equipped to do so.
I know time is at the end almost, so let me just offer the question on silos. So many of the countries that I reflect on in terms of my responsibilities are small island states. These are countries where you know, we're talking populations of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. And I think the lesson that we learn when we bring the small islands and the small states together in places like the Small States Forum, which the bank has been a wonderful champion for, is the ability to share experiences across. And I think there are a lot of lessons. I can think of a few countries in the Caribbean region, Grenada, and Prime Minister Mitchell sits on the Commission. I can think of Jamaica, who have tackled these issues in very holistic ways and continue to grapple with what that means. I'd also point to St. Lucia and Belize, who've both stepped up to have climate change policy assessments done and are taking lessons and benefiting from the kind of infrastructure gaps that get identified, the fiscal issues that emerge when you have a climate change policy assessment done. So there are a number of cases, and I again, back to Andrew's challenge maybe is as we think about the year ahead, I think there's going to be a lot of countries, communities, and local actors who are going to be keen to understand what lessons they can draw from other parts of the world. And I think the bank is so uniquely situated to be that kind of translator of lessons from one part of the world to the other, that I really look forward to seeing those stories emerge in a really concrete way.
Great, thank you. So our time, unfortunately, has come to an end. We won't be able to take any more questions, but Kristalina, I'd like to ask you or invite you if you want to say any final words, and then we'll have a photo with the WRI and the World Bank Adaptation and Resilience team real quick, and then we'll let everybody go.
Well, thank you. Well, what I want to end on is adaptation is nothing new. We as human race have been adapting over thousands of years to changing conditions. That is not new. What is new is that there are many more of us, many, many, many more. There is an impact we have created through our economic activities on our climate, and that requires for us to adapt much faster. We can do it. We are a creative bunch, but we won't do it unless we focus on it. So, focus.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for coming. Thanks to all of you for being here and those who sent questions from online. Let me invite the teams up who worked on these plans, both from WRI and the bank, and we'll get a quick photo. So thank you again.
Thank you, Laura.
Hogan.